Hello, and thank you all for attending our webinar today. My name is Jack Allen, and I am a Senior Analyst on the Cardiovascular and Metabolic team here at Datamonitor Healthcare. Thank you again for attending. Please do utilize the question box on the bottom of your screen, highlighted in red, if you do need any technical support throughout the broadcast. We do have members of the team standing by to help you with that. But without further ado, I'd like to start my presentation. I just want to talk to you about what we're going to go over in general today. And we're going to look at the dyslipidemia market, and we're going to talk about the title of this presentation being how the rise of add-on therapies will spur growth of the dyslipidemia market. So moving on, I just want to talk a little bit about the agenda of the overall presentation. So to begin today, I thought it would be useful for us to look at an overview of dyslipidemia as a disease first. And we're going to start by defining the disease and looking at some of the key patient subpopulations within the disease, as well as some of the risk factors for developing the disease and the epidemiology. And we're going to talk a little bit about our capabilities here at Datamonitor Healthcare with respect to epidemiology. After defining the disease, we're then going to go on to talk about the current treatment guidelines. Just a very brief overview of just the general trends in the current treatment guidelines. And then we'll move on to the treatment options. We're going to look at the current treatment options that are available for prescribing physicians today on a class-by-class basis. We're going to go through the statins, PCSK9 inhibitors, some of the other drug classes as well. And then we will look at the late-phase pipeline therapies, or more generally, we'll look at the overall development within the dyslipidemia space, and then look at some of the late-phase pipeline therapies in phase 3 clinical trials. And then rounding out our conversation, we'll start to look at the current prescribing trends based on some data we've gathered in-house at Datamonitor Healthcare. And then we'll go on to talk about our Dyslipidemia Forecast, the patient-based methodology that we employ here, and also some of the current and future market trends within the dyslipidemia market space that we see as influential and market moving forward. So without further ado, let's look at the disease definition of dyslipidemia. So dyslipidemia at its base is defined as an abnormal amount of lipids within the blood. And this abnormal amount of lipids can be attributed to a deviation from normal levels of cholesterol and or triglycerides. There are three key patient subgroups within dyslipidemia. You have your pure hypercholesterolemia patients, which have only elevations in their cholesterol levels. You have your pure hypertriglyceridemia patients who experience elevated triglyceride levels. And then you have your mixed hyperlipidemia patients, and these are patients that present with both elevated cholesterol and triglyceride levels. Also to note, I wanted to talk about the familial hypercholesterolemia patients. These are patients that have hypercholesterolemia due to a genetic defect in the 19th chromosome that makes the body unable to remove low-density lipoprotein and thus yields an elevated low-density lipoprotein cholesterol level, or LDL-C level, as we'll see later. And this mutation or defect can occur in a heterozygous or a homozygous fashion, the homozygous fashion obviously being more severe and less prevalent. In some, I've seen estimate the homozygous presentation as little as 3 patients in every million within the US and EU. Also of note, just for our practices today, patients who are receiving primary prevention before their first CV event are thought to be primary prevention patients. And this is something we asked about in the survey, as well as patients that have already had a CV event would be being prescribed secondary prevention therapy. Moving on. Just real briefly, I wanted to talk about the risk factors as it outlines some of the different epidemiology trends in the different marketplaces that we're going to look at in a second. So the first risk factor here I have is poor diet. Diets that are higher in saturated fats tend to increase your risk for dyslipidemia. These tend to be Western diets, and as diets tend to be deteriorating over time, we see a higher incidence of dyslipidemia. Along the same lines, obesity and lack of exercise. Less exercise is going to make you more higher risk for dyslipidemia, as well as obese patients are at particularly high risk. Smoking and diabetes, again, if you're a smoker or a diabetic, you're at a higher risk. Age, as patients tend to get older, you see a higher prevalence of dyslipidemia in the patient population. And then finally, the hereditary aspect of the disease being the familial hypocholesterolemia patients caused by a defect in the 19th chromosome. So now that we have a general idea of the definition of dyslipidemia, some of the key patient subgroups and risk factors, I thought it would be useful for us to outline the epidemiology and I guess the general patient population for the market sizing. So before we get too much into the dyslipidemia epidemiology, I wanted to just talk a little bit about the team here at Datamonitor Healthcare and our scope. So we have an in-house team of epidemiologists here at Datamonitor Healthcare, based in both the UK and up and down the East Coast of the US. They're a highly qualified group of people. All of them hold MPH degrees. And what they do for us is they produce 20-year country-specific forecasts for the US, Japan, and 5 major EU markets. The 5 major EU markets being France, Germany, Italy, Spain, and the UK. That being said, that they do these 7 major markets, they do also often produce existential markets outside of those 7 core markets. However, those 7 core markets are available for all of our diseases. Moving on, and I want to talk a little bit about the epidemiology of dyslipidemia and our reports on the site. So for dyslipidemia, our epidemiology team forecasted the total prevalent hypercholesteremia cases in each of those 7 major markets, and they stratified them by age, gender, risk of coronary artery disease, and country. Stratification by age, gender, and country are fairly typical of our epidemiology reports. However, this risk of coronary artery disease is a bit unique to the dyslipidemia epidemiology content. Moving forward, let's talk a little about the trends in each of these markets. So in 2018, our epidemiology forecast predicts that there are about 267.7 million total prevalent cases of hypercholesteremia across the US, Japan, and 5 major European markets. So a very, very large patient population in general. As you can see in the graph here, the rate of increase or decrease is different from market to market. So I wanted to talk a little bit about the changing market dynamics within each of the specific markets. So the key driver here being the change in demographics and mainly the age of the patient population. So with the US patient population aging, we expect the US market to increase by 14% over the forecast period, that being from 2015 to 2035. We expected a 14% increase. The US demographic seems to be remaining relatively stable, and as a result, we're seeing a relatively flat projection across the forecast period, while the Japanese market is actually decreasing by 6.1% over the forecast period. Now that we've spoken a little bit about the epidemiology, the disease in general, I thought it would be useful to get a general background of the treatment guidelines and how physicians look at the disease. So here I've presented to you the American Association of Clinical Endocrinologists guidelines for the treatment of dyslipidemia. And what I really wanted to highlight here, there are a number of different guidelines for the treatment of the disease. but there's this general trend across most of the treatment guidelines that in higher risk patients, you have a lower LDL-C goal. There's a lot of data being drawn out that lower LDL-C seems to be better, and that's what I really wanted to highlight here. So for example, with respect to LDL-C, if you have a low risk patient, your treatment goal would be to get their LDL-C levels below 130 milligrams per deciliter, while if you have an extreme risk patient, you would be prescribing more aggressive therapies in order to drive their LDL-C level to a minimum of 55 milligrams per deciliter. I guess 54.999 because you want to be under 55, but you get the idea in that higher risk patients have more aggressive treatment goals, and the goals are getting more aggressive and aggressive with respect to LDL-C levels. Another key guideline for those that are interested in looking into others as well is the American College of Cardiology clinical guidelines as well. Now that we've talked a little bit about the disease, the epidemiology, and the current treatment guidelines being higher risk patients have lower LDL goals, I want to now look at the current treatment options available to prescribing physicians that are treating dyslipidemia patients. So looking at the dyslipidemia market as a whole, I wanted to pull a little bit of data from one of our products here at Informa, Biomed Tracker. Biomed Tracker, for those unfamiliar, follows the clinical drugs in development across almost every indication. So it's a very extensive database and allows for you to pull on an indication by indication basis how many pharmaceutical products are both in development and have been approved. So what I did here was I pulled the data from Biomed Tracker for the pharmaceutical products approved for dyslipidemia, and I found that there were 31 pharmaceutical products approved. Some key trends that I realized in pulling this data is that a number of large pharmaceutical companies tend to dominate the dyslipidemia market. So as you can see, 4 of the top 5 pharmaceutical companies with respect to approved medications for dyslipidemia are large pharmaceutical companies, those being Merck with the most drugs approved, followed by Pfizer, AbbVie, and AstraZeneca, and then Callo Company rounds out the top 5. So those are 4 major players within the top 5. And the real reason for this is that there's, as we've seen, a large patient population, and having this large scale and distribution ability of the major pharma companies does give them an advantage with respect to treating this disease. The other key trend within this data that I'd like to highlight today is that the market is heavily genericized, with 31 of the 19 approved products facing generic competition currently. This is something that we'll see when we talk later on about the forecast a bit more in this generic uptake. But as you can see, I've differentiated the generic products, or the products facing generic competition, in the darker purple, while the products without generic competition are in the lighter pink on the graph below. Now that we've looked at the general development scope and, or I guess, approved landscape in dyslipidemia, I thought it'd be useful to go through on a class-by-class basis some of the medications approved for the treatment of dyslipidemia. So to start, we're going to start with the most commonly prescribed therapy to dyslipidemia patients, and that is the statin class. Here I've listed some of the key branded statin therapies. And as I mentioned, they're the most commonly prescribed therapies to dyslipidemia patients. One of the reasons they're commonly prescribed is that they're relatively easy for patients to take, being that they're available in oral formulations and administered once daily. These brands also do face a significant amount of generic competition, with the last major statin being Crestor to lose market exclusivity in the U.S. in May of 2016. This is something we'll look into, the generic erosion of Crestor and more generally the statin market when we talk about the forecast and marketed trends at the end of this presentation. Just to give a general idea of the efficacy of this class of therapies. Dependent on the dose, one could expect to observe an LDL-C reduction of around 40 to 60% from baseline versus a patient that is not receiving anything in a true placebo setting. The last point that I'd like to make about the statins is that they do have this one fairly major drawback in that some patients do report muscle weakness or muscle pain on statin therapies, especially at the elevated doses. That has led to this development of the statin-intolerant patient population. However, I should note there's no clinical diagnosis necessarily for statin intolerance, though a number of different organizations have made efforts to characterize this patient population. Moving on, we have the oral statin add-on class. The class is really only made up of Zetia at the moment, though there will be some additions hopefully to the class moving forward with the late-phase pipeline molecules. Zetia is the second most commonly prescribed therapy for dyslipidemia patients. Again, it's an oral once-daily medication, and it's facing generic competition in the U.S. as it lost market exclusivity in April 2017. So again, we'll see the generic erosion when we talk about the forecast later on in the presentation. And then just to speak very generally about the efficacy of Zetia, you would expect to see a reduction in LDL-C levels of between 10 to 20%, depending on the patient, versus placebo monotherapy or versus statin background therapy, so in combination. So what's key to think about here is that you're first going to give a patient a statin therapy, and then often, if they're not meeting their goal, you will add on this Zetia or generic ezetimibe, and you will observe an anticipated reduction in LDL-C levels of between 10 to 20% versus their new baseline. So their new baseline would be what they observed after taking the statin therapy. Moving on, I want to talk about one of the novel classes of therapies in dyslipidemia, and that is the PCSK9 inhibitor class. So there are two approved PCSK9 inhibitors on the market today. Repatha, marketed by Amgen and Astellas, and Praluent, marketed by Sanofi and Regeneron. These products were first approved in the US and EU in 2015, and in Japan in 2016. And they were first approved for an LDL-C lowering indication. However, when entering the market, mortality and CV benefit had not yet been determined. This will be a key trend moving forward as we discuss their uptake during the forecast. In December of 2017, however, Repatha was able to secure an amendment to their label reflecting their reduced risk of CV events observed in the Fourier outcomes trial. So they do now have this reduction in CV events in patients with established atherosclerotic disease on their label. While Praluent is due to read out their cardiovascular outcomes trial and hopefully gain a similar label expansion, and that readout is due on March 10th at the American College of Cardiology meetings in Orlando, Florida, a highly anticipated trial that hopefully the results will at least line up with that of Repatha, and potentially, given the longer follow-up of Praluent, will gain a greater insight into these new agents and their efficacy with respect to CV events. Again, speaking more generally, these molecules, are, as opposed to the statins and statin add-on, Zetia that was discussed previously, are administered subcutaneously on a biweekly or monthly basis. With respect to efficacy, you can expect to see a reduction in LDL-C of greater than 50% as compared to background statin therapy. So, as I mentioned previously, statins still remain the standard of care and that they're the most commonly prescribed therapy. However, if a patient is not meeting their goal on statin therapy, the idea here being that you would add a PCSK9 inhibitor to their regimen and reduce their new background baseline by an additional 50%. So a significant reduction versus the statin background therapy. However, a drawback of these molecules is that these products is that they're monoclonal antibodies, and the cost of production of monoclonal antibodies is higher than that of a small molecule such as the statins. Though it is not $14,000 per patient per year to produce these molecules, that is what the marketing companies have decided to land on with respect to cost. And this high cost has resulted in a significant amount of payer pushback, as payers saw a large patient population that these pharmaceutical companies were targeting with an extremely high-priced drug, and really became a little bit troubled by the idea of paying for these extremely expensive therapies for such a large patient population, and limited the uptake. Additionally, they were waiting to see what the reduction in CV events was, as we had not yet been to such low LDL-C levels. So we wanted to see, with this highly efficacious therapy, if there was still a reduction in CV events and a clinical benefit observed there. So it will be a trend that we're looking at moving forward. Finally, I just want to round out our discussion with a few of the other treatment options for dyslipidemia patients. So here we have the triglyceride-lowering medications, the fibrates, nisans, and omega-3 fatty acids, and then I've also listed some of the key brands within each of these classes. These medications are primarily given to patients with hypertriglyceridemia to lower their triglyceride levels, and they are heavily genericized in general, these three classes. Being heavily genericized, they're a bit outside of our scope here at Datamonitor Healthcare, as we do tend to focus our clinical commercial attractiveness on those branded products previously mentioned. And then we do have these other lipid-lowering agents, Juxtapid and Canamro. They are only approved for use in patients with homozygous familial hypocholesterolemia. So as I mentioned previously on a recent company call that I was listening to, the estimation for prevalence of familial hypocholesterolemia is about 3 in every million patients in the US and EU. So a very small patient population here with respect to their target. These medications have a poor side effect profile, and they feature box warnings for hepatotoxicity on their approved labels. Additionally, the cost of $250,000 per patient per year is much greater than any other therapy in this space, and as a result, their uptake has been limited. With respect to efficacy, they are comparable to the PCSK9 inhibitors. They entered the market previous to the PCSK9 inhibitors, and they are comparable to PCSK9 inhibitors, which has made it difficult for them to compete, being that the PCSK9 inhibitors are found to be much more safe and do not feature black box warnings for hepatotoxicity. And while they do cost $14,000 per patient per year in the U.S., that is significantly cheaper than the $250,000 per patient per year of these therapies. So there's strong competition from the PCSK9 inhibitors with respect to these other lipid-lowering agents. Now that we've talked about the approved therapies, I thought it would be useful to set the stage by talking about some of the drug candidates in development. So here again, I pulled some data from Biomed Tracker. Previously, I displayed their data on the approved pharmaceutical products. Here I'm displaying their data on the unique pharmaceutical products that have dyslipidemia listed as their lead indication in development. Additionally, here I've displayed some data from Pharma Premia on the probability of success for each candidate in dyslipidemia at each stage of development. So as you can see here, for example, in phase 1, Biomed Tracker tells us that there are 10 unique pharmaceutical products with dyslipidemia as their lead indication. From Pharma Premia, we get this probability of success metric that measures historically based on about 10 years of data from the product, phase 1 molecules have a 62% chance of making it to phase 2. So historically, 62% of dyslipidemia phase 1 products progress to phase 2 of development. Similarly, 45% of phase 2 products progress to phase 3, and 71% from phase 3 to NDA, and 77% from NDA to drug approval. So I just want to highlight that as Pharmapremia is a rather new offering from the Pharma Intelligence portfolio, and rather powerful tool with respect to assessing risk in each phase of development for specific indications as well. This is for only pharmaceutical products in development for dyslipidemia. However, it does span the broad developmental space that is similar to that of Biomed Tracker for those familiar. Please do feel free to ask any questions in the question box if you do have a specific indication you're interested in targeting with respect to that tool. So now that we've seen the general development overview of dyslipidemia, I want to look at the 4 phase 3 pharmaceutical products, as that's really our scope here at Datamonitor Healthcare, late phase pharmaceutical products, as well as marketed pharmaceutical products. So looking at the 4 phase 3 candidates, 3 unique kind of entries appear. So we have dalsacretib from Darkpool Pharmaceuticals. It's a CTEP inhibitor, and the mechanism here is shown to increase HDLC, or high-density lipoprotein cholesterol. It should be noted that the CTEP inhibitor class has been fraught with failures and suspensions. Most recently so, Merck's anacetrapib, another CTEP inhibitor, was suspended this past fall despite hitting its primary endpoint in the large-scale cardiovascular outcomes REVEAL trial. I believe the REVEAL trial enrolled somewhere in the order of 30,000 patients, so a very large and likely expensive trial. They did hit the primary endpoint, and in discussions with key opinion leaders, Merck made the decision not to even file for approval of the medication. I guess they judged that the clinical benefit observed in the trial was not significant enough to bring the product to market. So it's a major setback to this class, and dalsacretib does remain in development. It should be noted that dalsacretib is looking at a specific genetic population and in the hopes of observing a greater efficacy as compared to a broader population that was observed in the other CTEP trials. So hopefully for dalsacretib, this specific genetic population does respond better to the therapy as compared to other genetic populations. Moving on, we have inclisiran being developed by the medicines company with a partnership with Alnylam Pharmaceuticals. This product is small interfering ribonucleic acid targeting PCSK9. So it does have the same mechanism of action as the PCSK9 inhibitor monoclonal antibodies, however, it does it a slightly different way. Because they are so similar in how they do lower cholesterol levels, we expect this product to compete with the monoclonal antibody PCSK9 inhibitors, Repatha and Praluent, upon entry to the market, pending strong phase 3 results. Finally, rounding out the phase 3 pipeline, we have bempedoic acid, as well as the bempedoic acid and generic ezetimibe fixed dose combination, both in development by Asterion Therapeutics. It's a novel mechanism. It's an ATP citrate lysase inhibitor, and they have registrational trial data expected in 2018 with a key safety readout coming in May of this year. It's an oral agent, and we're going to look into more about the comparison between inclisiran and bempedoic acid, kind of the two key phase 3 candidates in this space, being that the CETP inhibitor class has been fraught with failures previously. So now we want to look at those two key products. So here I've developed a side-by-side comparison of these two products. So on the left, we have inclisiran, and on the right, we have bempedoic acid. And for this table, I'm speaking more broadly about bempedoic acid and its franchise in that being comprised of bempedoic acid monotherapy, as well as bempedoic acid and ezetimibe fixed-dose combination. To start, I wanted to mention their approval strategies, and that both are going for LDL-C lowering indications to gain first approval, and then afterwards they're running large-scale cardiovascular outcomes trials in hopes of demonstrating cardiovascular benefit and gaining an expanded label, similar to that approval strategy of the monoclonal antibody PCSK9 that I mentioned previously. With respect to dosing, inclisiran is a subcutaneous injection given semi-annually, while bempedoic acid is an oral tablet given once daily. So bempedoic acid being an oral tablet is similar to ezetimibe or Zetia and the statin therapies, while inclisiran is a subcutaneous injection given semi-annually. It will compete with the PCSK9 inhibitors that are given biweekly or bi-monthly. So a reduction in dose there. With respect to efficacy, here I have the mean LDL-C reduction from the Orion trial, phase 2 trial of inclisiran, was a 52% reduction versus background statin therapy, similar to that observed by the monoclonal antibodies. While bempedoic acid plus ezetimibe in combination with 20 milligrams of atorvastatin was shown to reduce LDL-C by 64% as compared to placebo, so not versus baseline statin therapy. There are a number of trials from the bempedoic acid franchise. This is the one that I selected to talk about the general efficacy. It seems to be almost as efficacious as Zetia, so even given in combination with statins and Zetia, you could expect to see another 10 to 20% decrease in LDL-C levels from the new baseline of a patient that was on statin and Zetia. With respect to safety profile, inclisiran has observed some infrequent injection site reactions. However, overall, the safety profile has been quite strong and in line with that of the PCSK9 inhibitors, while bempedoic acid hasn't really yielded any adverse safety signals. But as I mentioned previously, there is this key phase 3 safety data coming out in May of this year. With respect to anticipated competition, inclisiran is expected to compete with the approved PCSK9 inhibitors, Repatha and Praluent, while in my view I see bempedoic acid as well as the combination regimen with ezetimibe competing against primarily Zetia for market share. However, Zetia will be genericized, as we'll see later on in the forecast. So these are not direct comparisons in the way that the PCSK9 inhibitors are to inclisiran. For forecasting cost, we took a 30% discount to the marketed PCSK9 inhibitors with respect to inclisiran, putting it at an expected price of $7,500 per year per patient in the U.S. This is an estimation, and the medicines company has not yet indicated exactly what their price is. They have indicated that they expect their production costs to be much less than the monoclonal antibodies, and that they are going to price it in a cost-effective manner, which some have argued that the PCSK9 inhibitors are not priced in a cost-effective manner. With respect to the bempedoic acid franchise, I expected it to enter the market at a price in line with branded Zetia, as I see that as the greatest or the most applicable analog for this product. And that price will be $2,500 per patient per year in the U.S. Approval estimations in the U.S. for inclisiran are Q3 2020 and Q4 2020 for the EU, while bempedoic acid we expect to be on the market by the end of 2019 in the US and early 2020 in the EU. Moving forward, I want to talk now about the current prescribing trends, and then I'm going to round out this conversation with some talk about the forecast, our methodology, and then also some of the key market trends of dyslipidemia. So here at Datamonitor Healthcare, we gauge the market prescribing trends via large-scale primary research surveys. We survey at least 30 physicians in each of the 7 major markets, them being the US, Japan, and 5 European markets, to gain insight into what they're prescribing their patients at a given point in time, being when we ask the survey. The survey data is then reviewed by our internal research team to ensure its accuracy. So as you can see here, I know that the font is a bit small on this screen, but I did want to show kind of an example of our treatment trees, in that we take a prevalent patient population, we then segment it based on patient subgroups. So we have the mixed hyperlipidemia subgroup, the pure hypertriglyceridemia, and then we have the pure hypercholesteremia subgroup in orange, purple, and green, respectively. And then within the pure hypercholesteremia, we have in blue the non-familial patients, the heterozygous familial, and the homozygous familial patients. And then at each of those patient segmentations, we're able to ask the physicians as to what percentage of patients receive each regimen. So that is what's described in each of those 5 larger boxes. The highlighted red therapies are regimens, the highlighted red regimens are those that contain statin therapies. So what I wanted to highlight here is the high use of statin therapies in the treatment of dyslipidemia. As you can see, majority of the regimens prescribed to patients do feature a statin. Now that we've spoken a little bit about the current treatment landscape and that it's heavily reliant on statin therapies, I wanted to talk about first our forecast methodology and then a few marketed trends from our forecast. So as I did mention previously, we do these large-scale primary research surveys, and we gain insight as to what physicians are prescribing today, and that being a number of different regimens, mainly most featuring statin therapies. After we gain that insight into what physicians are prescribing today, we apply that to our epidemiology numbers, and we get a baseline brand penetration for each therapy. After gaining a baseline brand penetration for each therapy, we have a tool here that allows us to model shifting market dynamics. So as an analyst, we are able to look at a number of different tools and see what we see as market-changing events moving forward. And after we evaluate those market-changing events and what we see as their effect on the market, we then put those into the forecast and we shift patients based on as we see that event affecting the market landscape. After we've shifted patients, we then apply a compliance percentage, cost per year, and we arrive at a total brand sales per year for each of the 10 years that we do our forecasts. So now we've talked about the current treatment landscape and our forecast methodology and this patient-based forecast methodology. I want to talk a little bit generally about some key market trends that we see moving forward. So there are kind of 4 key market trends that I'm going to talk to you about today with respect to the dyslipidemia market. The first of which I mentioned previously, is the genericization of the statin class. Lipitor was the largest statin therapy, one of the largest or best-selling pharmaceutical agents ever, lost its patent expiration in 2010. Crestor is losing market exclusivity in all 7 of the major markets in 2017. And Zetia, though I know it's not a statin therapy, we're going to lump it in with the statin therapies as well, has lost market exclusivity in the US in 2017. So a heavy amount of genericization in this statin class, and we'll see how that uptake of generics is going to kind of erode the branded sales in this marketplace. Next, I'd like to talk about the uptake of the PCSK9 inhibitors and what are going to be driving factors of that. As I mentioned previously, payers have limited uptake by placing strict prior authorization criteria on the PCSK9 inhibitors. However, the marketing companies hope that the availability of their cardiovascular outcomes data, which shows reductions in CV events, that it allows payers to quantify how much cost savings they will see in reduction of their event with the therapy, helps validate their pricing decision. It's their idea. We did get the first cardiovascular outcomes trial from Repatha in March of 2017. We saw a reduction in CV events. However, the follow-up was on average, I believe, 24, 26 months, so a fairly short follow-up. What we'll see in the Odyssey cardiovascular outcomes trial probably went available March 10th as a late-breaking clinical abstract at the ACC conference, as I mentioned previously. We'll hopefully see a longer follow-up and a confirmation of this effect in that there is a lowering of CV events in this trial as well. That is similar to what we would have extrapolated out from the Fourier trial, if not better. We'll then also look at the market entry of inclisiran and how it will compete against the PCSK9 inhibitors, primarily that being on price. As the payers have really pushed back, mainly due to price, not necessarily cost per efficacy, but if inclisiran is able to remain similarly efficacious to the marketed PCSK9 inhibitors coming at a lower price, payers may be highly receptive to this medication. And then we'll also look at the bempedoic acid franchise by Asterion Therapeutics and how the fixed dose combination with ezetimibe will allow for greater efficacy as compared to the bempedoic acid monotherapy or ezetimibe monotherapy alone. And as a result, we anticipate that this will gain the strongest uptake with respect to the franchise as opposed to the monotherapy. So first, let's look at the genericization of the statin class. So as I mentioned previously, Lipitor, one of the best-selling pharmaceutical products ever, experienced global sales in 2010 of over $11.9 billion. This is pulled by MedTrack. We do have a pharmaceutical or a sales research tool here at Informa as well, if that is something anyone is interested in. However, after 5 years after the launch, in 2015, sales were only $2.1 billion for the franchise. Not small, but not $11.9 billion, so an 85% decline. As I mentioned, recently, Crestor experienced patent expiration in 2016. Those sales had already been declining based on the carryover effect of the entrance of generic Lipitor. We expect in 2021 the global sales to be around $800 million for this franchise, about an 80% decrease. So a similar pattern of decrease with Lipitor. And then finally, we have Zetia. Lost market exclusivity in the U.S. in December of 2016. I believe it was an authorized generic that was launched. EU patent expiration is expected in the second quarter of 2018, and Japanese market exclusivity should be lost in the third quarter of 2019. With respect to global sales in 2016, we observed $2.6 billion in global sales as reported by the company. Our forecasted global sales 5 years out are about $600 million, and we expect, again, an 80% decline. So what we've done here is we've benchmarked the decline of Crestor and Zetia to that of Lipitor. So we will see on the next slide what this decline looks like. So as you can see here, we do have some continuing decline of Lipitor, though it is quite minimal. And then we have the loss of market exclusivity of Crestor, Zetia, and Vytorin. Vytorin is a combination of Zetia and statin therapy. I believe Crestor. All relatively recent losses of exclusivity, and you'll see the loss of branded sales at the cost of generic competition is pretty significant and levels off to be about 20% of the previous branded sales in about a 5-year period, as displayed here by the curves. Next, we'd like to go on and just talk briefly about the uptake of the PCSK9 inhibitors. In order to do this, I thought it'd be great to talk one more time about the current status of the launch, and I gave it a thumbs down as it has been quite disappointing for the marketing companies. Prior to approval, they were expected to be mega blockbuster drugs with a conservative estimate of sales being greater than $3 billion. However, as I mentioned, payers saw these highly expensive therapies for large patient populations and needed quantifiable cardiovascular data before they were allowing significant uptake. So they put large prior authorization criteria to limit uptake. In 2016, about 80% of initial prescriptions, the first attempts, were rejected. Moving forward, so I wanted to outline first the current status of the launch, and now we're going to talk moving forward. So with respect to Repatha, we did get that cardiovascular outcomes trial from Fourier in March of 2017. The median follow-up was, as previously mentioned, 26 months versus a meta-analysis which many were comparing it to the statins, where the follow-up was 5.1 years. Payers, or some argued that the reduction observed in the Repatha trial was not as great as that of the statins. Based on this difference in follow-up, a few key opinion leaders also wanted to highlight that and mention that you can't compare the overall difference in efficacy, being that the statin patients were followed for 5.1 years, while Repatha only had a little over 2 years to show its additional efficacy. You really need to look at the 2-year endpoint in the statin therapy meta-analysis, and if you do look at that, they are similar with respect to efficacy. With respect to efficacy, at this 26-month follow-up, Repatha did reduce cardiovascular death, myocardial infarction, stroke, and hospitalization for unstable angina or coronary revascularization, with a relative risk reduction of about 15%, I believe, a hazard ratio, of 0.85. That was the primary endpoint that was met by Repatha in the clinical trial. Additionally, key being the shorter follow-up, that it did statistically significantly reduce stroke and myocardial infarction as their own secondary endpoints. And this data, as I mentioned previously, did result in the amended label in 2017 to reflect the reduction in CV events observed in patients with atherosclerotic disease in this clinical trial. Parliament is expecting these Odyssey outcomes data in March of this year, and we expect a longer follow-up, and hopefully the longer follow-up will continue to see a separation in the risk curves that we observed at 2 years with Repatha, and hopefully the results will be at least in line with Repatha, if not better, further validating the PCSK9 mechanism. We expect that the outcomes trials to be a key growth driver of relaxation of prior authorization criteria by payers. And as we'll see here on the next slide, we expect uptake of PCSK9 inhibitors to increase rather significantly in the years to come. As you can see here, we forecasted the PCSK9 monoclonal antibody sales with Repatha gaining a slight advantage due to their earlier cardiovascular outcomes trial. We expect sales to peak at about $7 billion across the 7 major markets in about 2024. With respect to efficacy, we've shown previously that they're highly efficacious compounds, they're relatively safe, and if these cardiovascular outcomes trials do read out, if Praluent does read out as expected, we expect a reduction in reimbursement restrictions and payers to begin to adopt these therapies as they do find them more or highly efficacious in the long run. So those will be the key growth drivers for the marketed monoclonal antibody PCSK9 inhibitors. We do expect those prior authorization criteria to be relaxed, hopefully in the rather near term. Next, I'd like to talk about the market entry of inclisiran. Inclisiran being the siRNA PCSK9 product. With respect to timeline, as I mentioned previously, we expect market launch in the US in Q3 of 2020 and market launch in the EU in Q4 of 2020 as well. The product is not in development in Japan, so we've not forecasted uptake in Japan. And these market expectations for launch are based on the guidance by the company that they expect phase 3 data from their LDL-C lowering programs by the end of 2019. Additionally, cardiovascular outcomes data from inclisiran is expected to be available in the first quarter of 2023. Though this effect is expected to be hopefully widely anticipated based on the previous results of the 2 monoclonal antibody PCSK9 inhibitor cardiovascular outcome trials. So it may not be as highly anticipated as that of the Praluent data that will help validate the PCSK9 class. As I mentioned, inclisiran is a semi-annual subcutaneous dose with a dosing schedule of a dose of 300 milligrams at day 0, 300 milligrams at day 90, and then 300 milligrams every 180 days after. We expect that the discounted costs will hopefully drive strong uptake of this molecule or this product, as it will provide payers with a cheaper option that is similarly efficacious to the PCSK9 inhibitors. Again, we'll compete primarily with PCSK9 inhibitors. We expect the cost to be a key driver of growth, as well as the PCSK9 mechanism being well validated at launch by the already availability of the 2 PCSK9 inhibitor cardiovascular outcome trials with the Fourier data last year and the Odyssey outcomes trial this year. And then there is this minor effect of a reduced injection burden. The combination of these 3 effects should should result in rapid adaptation of inclisiran, as we'll see on the next slide. Here I've provided the forecasted patient numbers for the PCSK9 inhibitors across the 7 major markets. And as you can see, inclisiran will, in our forecast, we have as the market leader in 2025 with over 1 million patients. And this is due to those 3 real primary drivers of growth: the similar efficacy to that of the PCSK9, so strong efficacy with a lower cost and a lower dosing schedule is expected to allow it to compete very effectively against the PCSK9 inhibitors. Moving on, I want to speak again about the market entry of bempedoic acid by Spur Therapeutics. I've already gone through the timeline, so with a short amount of time left today, I'm not going to go through that again. But we expect the fixed dose combination as well to launch in Q1 of 2020 in the US and Q2 of 2020 in the EU. Cardiovascular outcomes data for this product will be a bit more highly anticipated, being that there aren't any true comparators here as compared to inclisiran, and it will be available in Q1 of 2022. Bempedoic acid is expected to compete primarily with generic ezetimibe. However, the combination therapy of bempedoic acid and generic ezetimibe will likely gain stronger uptake as compared to bempedoic acid monotherapy on its own. This is due to 2 key reasons. Fixed dose combination is expected to provide greater efficacy as compared to the monotherapy, and the monotherapy may not be as cost effective as compared to generic ezetimibe. The monotherapy has been shown to be similarly efficacious to generic ezetimibe, and with generic ezetimibe being generic, it is expected that many physicians would prefer the lower cost alternative as compared to bempedoic acid monotherapy. Due to differences in efficacy, we don't expect bempedoic acid or the franchise in general to compete head-to-head with PCSK9 inhibitors. Take a look at the general uptake with respect to patient numbers for the bempedoic acid franchise. So this is based on an expectation that both the bempedoic acid monotherapy and fixed dose combinations will be well tolerated. With respect to these results will be out in May of 2018, so we'll be looking at that safety data to revise our assumptions come those results. However, we expect bempedoic acid fixed dose combination to drive sales of this franchise, accounting for about 75% of the market uptake. As you can see, 1.8 million patients across the 7 major markets as compared to only about 650,000 patients for the monotherapy. Finally, I'd like to just briefly summarize some of the key market trends. So as I mentioned previously, statin sales are expected to decrease as major brands will lose market exclusivity, and thus, as generic competition enters the market, the cost lowering of generics is expected to increase uptake there. We expect strong uptake of the PCSK9 inhibitors, primarily due to the availability of cardiovascular outcomes trials, with 4 years data available in March of this past year, and probably with Odyssey outcomes trial data coming in March of this year. These are expected to show CV events and allow payers to quantify the benefit of these medications, thus allowing them to negotiate prices that are good for both parties and increase uptake. Additionally, we expect inclisiran to experience strong and rapid uptake due to its similarity with the PCSK9 inhibitors, however, reduced costs. So we expect payers to really drive providers to utilize inclisiran come its approval. Finally, with respect to bempedoic acid and the generic ezetimibe fixed dose combination, we expect that to drive franchise use due to the increased efficacy as compared to generic ezetimibe and bempedoic acid monotherapy on their own. This will be the cost-effective oral option that's coming to market. Finally, one last note is that there are new dyslipidemia guidelines expected in late 2018 or early 2019 from the American College of Cardiology, and these may further lower the LDL-C goals of patients. If this is the case, we expect that to significantly increase the uptake of PCSK9 inhibitors as well as inclisiran and bempedoic acid generic ezetimibe, as these new therapies allow for lower and lower LDL-C goals. Thank you so much for taking the time to attend this webinar. I hope that you found some of this information useful. I've listed here my email. Please feel free to reach out directly to me, or also please feel free to add any questions that are at the top of your mind right now to the question box as well at the bottom of the screen. It seems that we've taken up the complete hour here today, so unfortunately I will not have any time for questions live on the phone right now. However, hopefully we'll be able to get back to your questions in a timely manner. Thank you again so much for attending, and please feel free to reach out with any questions with respect to the presentation or any of the products mentioned throughout the course. Thank you again.